Narochnitskaya was a representative of the Motherland Party and vice chairman of the Russian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen and Natalia, he sat here on this show earlier this year, he sat in that very chair, and he said to me, quote, "We are pretty close to a new Cold War because of Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine." Do you agree that we're in the middle of a new Cold War, on the verge of a new Cold War because of Ukraine?
What about Ukraine? Of course we do care about Ukraine. My ancestors are from Ukraine. But there was a coup d'etat in Kiev. The constitution was dismissed. Even the mandate of president went to the Speaker of Parliament, whether under constitution it should go to the Prime Minister. The Constitutional Court was dismissed.
Let's assume there was a coup d'etat. There's a division of opinion on that, of course, whether it was a coup or not. Crimea was taken by the Russians, annexed in violation of international law. Most lawyers would argue.
Crimea
the
has
UN
a
General Assembly.
referendum. And,
why do you think 100 countries at the UN condemned the annexation of Crimea? 100. Only 11 countries voted with Russia. Why do you think that is?
Because it's politics.
Politics 10 to 1.
In the 21st century. The politics in the 21st
It's not
century.
because that the United Nations recognizes national borders and sovereignty and says you can't just change the borders of a country. You talked about common borders.
The international law, let me just finish.
Okay.
The international law teaches now that self-determination right is observed, but the principle of territorial integrity prevails. That's true. Only, but in a case when self-determination rights are combined with so-called, it's in the textbooks of international law, when the people maintain historical, linguistic, cultural, and other types of
so on that basis, Crimea can be independent.
With the maternal state.
So you support the idea that Crimea, on this, your reading of international law, Crimea had the right to leave Ukraine and be part of Russia on the basis of self-determination?
I think so.
Okay, so when will Russia be holding a referendum in Chechnya and in Dagestan for those places to go independent?
Let them do it.
You're in support of that? You're happy for Chechnya to leave the Russian Federation and become independent or join another country?
They don't
Seriously?
want it.
They don't want it, but if they did, you support Chechen independence under a referendum in which the Chechens voted yes?
That depends always on how the people's will is expressed. If it's expressed by the bandits and gangsters and criminals,
because there were no bandits or gangsters in Crimea, were there? There were no men in masks. We just imagined those people
But
on our
if there
screens.
are teachers, students, engineers, doctors voting calmly on their, expressing their free will, it's different. So don't make, Chechnya doesn't want to leave Russia. They now are flourishing more than any others. After you bombed them for several years and killed hundreds of thousands of people, I guess not. When Crimea was annexed by Russia, you said that for the first time in 20 years of political life, you felt happy. The West had pushed Russia into a corner, you said, and finally Russia has shown its red line. I'm just wondering, is the red line now fixed in place, or is it going to move geographically into other areas, perhaps in the region? That's it? Or are we going to see some more redrawing of borders in that area? Russia has proven through 25 years that it is ready and absolutely tolerating Ukraine's, floating this and that, under only one condition that was shown and obvious, that Ukraine doesn't enter NATO.
Ukraine didn't enter NATO.
Even in September, before the Maidan started, Russia has no idea of what then happened, etc., and had no plans.
Ukraine did not enter NATO.
It's the West who refused, who wanted to create from Supercrane a battlefield between East and West, and it's Americans.
You don't want Ukraine
Russia,
to join NATO.
in cooperation with Ukraine, is still a superpower, but without Ukraine, Ukraine as enemy is no more superpower.
Can I give some friendly advice to the Russian government via you? If you don't want your neighbor to join a military alliance, best not to invade and occupy part of that country, because the first thing they want to do is join a military alliance.
Very good. Why are you so on the side of NATO? On the
I'm
Americans?
on the side of NATO.
Yes, of course.
Maybe you should watch the show I did with the former head of NATO, where I put all these arguments together. In eastern Ukraine, are there Russian forces in eastern Ukraine?
Not Russian forces. Separate Russians, yes, but not Russian forces.
So
it's different legally at all.
So when a Russian...
So do you mean there are, squads on parts of the army with tanks crossing?
Exactly what I'm asking.
No.
Okay, so when
no.
a Russian Special Forces soldier, Dmitry Shapnikov, tells the BBC that he and his fellow troops were in Ukraine, when captured soldier in Ukraine, Alexander Anatolyevich, identifies himself as a Russian serviceman in the Russian armed forces, what were they doing there? Sightseeing? Taking a tour?
It is denied.
It is denied by?
By officials.
Do you agree with them?
I quite agree, but I believe that there are some Russian soldiers, of course, and officers. I don't deny that. But legally, every country, when it's helping the situation according to the interest and according to the appeal, they do it legally correct.
But it's not illegal for Russian soldiers to be in Ukraine, under any reading of international law.
Was it legal for American specialists in all places where they have been?
Was it legal for Americans to be in Iraq? No. Okay,
Good.
back to the question. Was it illegal? Is it legal for Russian forces to be in Ukraine?
There are no forces. Don't use the term forces.
But the specific one about Ukrainians wanted change. And they've proved that in elections, they've proved that in Maidan.
The Maidan started as a protest against
Ordinary
oligarchy, mafia, corruption, and there is no doubt that Yanukovych regime was not only the perfect, but was symbol of all that. But the extremist, fascist forces were made an instrument.
Fascists?
No, fascist.
Do you know how many seats the neo-Nazi party Svoboda has in the Ukrainian parliament right now?
Well, believe me.
Do you know how many seats they have?
Svoboda lost.
How many seats do they have in the parliament?
Very few.
6.
6, yes.
That was a great fascist coup by them.
Yes, just dial in the internet, for instance, torch processions in Kiev. You will see that every 1st of January there are fascists with bandera, with even swastikas, with torch burning, walking down the streets, and there are thousands of them.
The Russian authorities don't have problems with fascists when they're on their side. Come on.
Our fascists do not demonstrate on streets, and
no, come on. Natalia, fascists and Holocaust deniers are welcome in Russia when they're on the Russian government side.
No, they're not welcome.
So the Duma,
at all.
the Russian Duma hasn't hosted Golden Dawn from Greece, hasn't hosted Jobbik from Hungary? Have they not hosted these parties? Golden Dawn is an openly neo-Nazi party. It's been hosted in the Duma.
They were, what do you mean by hosted?
I meant they walked through the door and Russian parliamentarians came and shook their hands.
Some deputies, of course.
No, the Speaker of the Parliament was involved with both the Front National, the Golden Dawn, and Jobbik.
Is part of the Hungarian Parliament?
Yes.
Yes, but then how can you call them?
Very easily, fascist parties can be part of parliaments. Golden Dawn has neo-Nazi swastikas on its flags, was hosted in the Duma. Marine Le Pen is a regular visitor to Moscow from the French National Front.
Marine Le Pen is not a fascist party.
Okay. Gentleman in the third row.
Do you think Russia and Putin's criminal regime has a right to break international law, shoot down civilian airplanes, occupy territory of sovereign neighbor states? Actually, for actions like that, they should be facing trial in the International Court of Law. And don't you think that actually Russia is much more resembling Nazi Germany right now than Ukraine? Because it's not Ukraine that it has an authoritarian state that occupies territory of its neighbors and poses as a real threat to the whole world.
Do you respond to that?
I detest anyone speaking such language against my country. I would never allow myself to use such language against official government. I was in a position to Yeltsin, but I never...
Hold on. Earlier you were suggesting that extremists were behind everything that happened in Ukraine. You don't mind chucking the Nazi label, extremist label at Ukrainians, but Ukrainians shouldn't throw it back at the Russians.
I said about torch processions, about fascism in Ukraine, but I never called Ukrainian government criminal regime.
A gentleman here in the front row.
I would like to ask you about this disaster with airplane that happened in Sinai. The question is the following. After nearly 2 weeks of silence, Putin finally stepped up and said, this is the terror attack. We will kill this and punish these people where they can be found. It's a disaster and so on. And we will do all possible means to punish these people. But on the other hand, when it happens with MH17, he applied all possible means to prevent punishment of the terrorists who destroyed this airplane.
The Malaysian airline flight that went down over Ukraine.
Yes, Malaysian one, including veto of Security Council to prevent punishment of these terrorists. So does it mean that Mr. Putin has good terrorists and bad terrorists?
No, I understand. I understand what you mean. From the very beginning, Russian side was proposing to have a full commission on the to explore all the details of this Malaysian Airlines crash, etc., because nobody believed that it was Russia from Russian weapons shot down.
Apart from the Dutch Safety Board. The Dutch Safety Board said it was a Russian missile.
In all investigation of such kind, all real and material evidence should be collected together. But what we
Russian-backed
know...
separatists wouldn't allow investigators to approach the crash site. The separatists backed by Russia wouldn't allow investigators to access the crash site.
Not at all. It's the other way around.
That's not what the investigators say.
They were neglected and they were rejected, even, and all these parts of the remnants of the plane.
Let's talk about some of the breaches of human rights. Yes. In February 2015, prominent opposition figure Boris Nemtsov was gunned down outside the Kremlin shortly before he was about to produce his report on Russian military involvement in eastern Ukraine. His daughter called it an act of political retribution and said that the state news channels were responsible for methodically fomenting hatred of her father and other opposition figures who were presented as traitors to the nation. We may never uncover the truth behind his death, but isn't it fair to say that the Putin media machine contributed to it at a very minimum?
Boris Nemtsov, whom I knew, to think that Boris Nemtsov posed any danger to government, or that means not to understand anything in Russian political life. Who needed his death?
Fine, you explained,
who needed? The government, the Kremlin.
Well, he was about to publish a report saying the opposite of what the government says about Ukraine.
All the serious experts think that it was done against Putin.
Well, let me ask you this question
such
then.
Prominent amongst the opposition
weird, Natalia?
people.
Isn't it weird that so many of Putin's critics and enemies, whether opposition figures, investigative journalists, former spies, they just seem to have this bad habit of getting assassinated? It's kind of a weird coincidence, is it not? That they all just die in weird circumstances.
Who always died?
Well,
who died?
We mentioned Boris Nemtsov. There's Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned here in the UK with polonium. The British police, the barrister representing the police, said the only credible explanation the only credible explanation was that the Russian state was involved in Mr. Litvinenko's murder.
You really think Litvinenko was murdered by Russians? You ignoring
I'm telling you what the investigation says.
The recent results of investigation that has nothing to do with Russia. Who needed his death? Well, at least there should be cui bono.
Well, the British inquiry thinks it was the Russians. His family think it was the Russians. Leading physicists think it was the Russians. A fair few people think it was the Russians.
No.
So no Boris. No Boris Nemtsov, no Alexander Litvinenko. Let's keep going.
Regardless of any of my political views, I'm sincerely thinking that Litvinenko's death was needed not by Russia, but
so Russia didn't need his death.
Russia.
They didn't need Boris Nemtsov's death. Anna Politkovskaya, the award-winning investigative journalist, was killed in 2006. The judge in her case said it was politically motivated. In March 2008, 2 TV journalists were killed a day after their names were put on an official media blacklist. The founder of the weekly Kremlin critical magazine Chernovik was killed in 2011. Being a journalist who's critical of the Putin government in Russia today doesn't seem to be too good for your life expectancy.
No, it's absolutely safe.
So then what about these people who are dead? Just coincidence that you get killed a day after you're put on a media blacklist?
The journalists might be killed in Russia because of their commercial things, engagements, like it was I remember in the 90s with the killing of the Vesti producer Listyev, for instance. It is proven there because...
The problem you have, Natalia, is you say, on the one hand, Russia's a normal country, and then on the other hand, in most normal countries, investigative journalists, critics of the government, don't just drop dead from time to time in mysterious circumstances.
They are not dropped dead because they are persecuted.
Why are they all killed then? What's the common theme?
There are some killings in Russia, and that's bad, but the criminal situation isn't good.
And when the Kremlin talks of fifth columnists, when Putin talks of national traitors, that doesn't contribute to an atmosphere in which critics of the government are killed.
Well, Russians' political vocabulary differs a little bit from the Western. Is it more harsh? And for us, for instance, doesn't mean as much as you. For instance, like...
In 2012, 1,000 Russians who were protesting Putin were attacked by riot police and detained. Human Rights Watch called it the worst political crackdown in Russia's post-Soviet history. Are those people on the streets, are they not your fellow Russians? Do you not worry about them?
There are many opposition leaders now, and they are all...
These were ordinary people, 1,000 people. They were not politicians. They were people protesting against what they thought were fraudulent elections. They were attacked. They were detained.
I remember the case
2012.
you're talking about. Yes. But it is proven perfectly well that they were provoking the police. And
1,000 people.
You see the videos, and it's not fake.
But Masha, you would have to accept you're Russian, but your fellow Russians do like Putin. He's massively popular in Russia. He wins elections. Polls show that they support his foreign policy and domestic policy.
Well, Stalin had not 86, but 99.9%. What does it tell you? It tells you that people, even today, are still afraid to tell you exactly, an interviewer exactly what they...
Do you believe there is a silent majority in Russia who are not fans of Putin? Really?
Well, I'm sure there is, but also I'm sure that there are people who are brainwashed by Russian propaganda. Because when Russian television shows you every day how Ukrainians crucify little boys or things like that, you would love Putin like just like Orwell's hero loved Big Brother. You know, propaganda works.
Okay, Vasyl Miroshnichenko, co-founder of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Ukrainians, as you said earlier, they've revolted against a president they didn't like. They had elections after that. Do you think that's ever going to happen in Russia anytime soon?
Never. It's never going to happen in Russia. But you see, this is a problem because the biggest tragedy for Putin is actually the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to revive Soviet Union, and of course, he doesn't recognize Ukraine as a nation. He stated it many times. He said it's a temporary thing on the map of Europe. Now that we were invaded by Russians, the only protection for us is actually NATO.
Do you worry that no matter how popular Putin is at home, today, Russia's more isolated than it's been for a long time in the international stage. He's subjected your country to sanctions. There's been a currency crisis. There's been all sorts of economic problems. He hasn't been so good for your country in terms of its image, its reputation, its standing in the world.
Well, I'm very sad that Ukrainian people hate Putin. I'm really very sad about that. But there is no isolation of Russia. Russia can't be isolated because it's a great power.